Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. And welcome to part 2 of the story of how Maximilian and Carlotta, the Habsburg power couple, became Emperor and Empress of Mexico in 1864. In part 1 we followed the story up to their triumphant entry into Mexico City. Let's see what happens next. So the entry into Mexico City, that's been a huge triumph and the celebrations have been fantastic. But now the hard work is starting and Maximilian is going to have to get down to governing. So what is the nature of his rule? My sense is that this isn't a constitutional monarchy exactly. It's Maximilian who's going to be taking the decisions, isn't it?
Yeah, so you're right. It's not a constitutional monarchy. Maximilian wants it to be one, and in fact he draws up a constitution which he writes himself in league with Mexican politicians in Europe. But the situation in Mexico is so volatile, Benito Juarez is undefeated, that he's never able to implement that. So you're right that personal power is, and essentially ruling by decree, is how this empire is going to be governed. With the complication, which we'll come back to, that there's dual power essentially, because the French retain enormous control over what's going on in Mexico, and indeed, in terms of the military command, that is entirely in the hands of the French, more or less. But what does Maximilian do? Was your question. So, well, his opponents would say very little. He is a man who loves to prevaricate, to discuss, to postpone. There's all kinds of problems in Mexico that need to be addressed. But perhaps the most crucial is the finances. Now, remember, listeners who've been paying attention, the reason there was an intervention in the first place was that Mexico suspended its foreign debt payment. So the Mexican treasury was bankrupted after Civil War, and Maximilian government fares little better. Enormous loans have been taken out in Europe to cover immediate expenditure. But Maximilian has to pay monthly sums to the French government to maintain the French army in Mexico, because Napoleon III, as he said, he wants glory on the cheap, and he's done what we might call today a leverage buyout. The cost of the conquest of Mexico is going to be paid for by Maximilian's government. If it isn't, Napoleon III can withdraw his troops because this is a treaty. It's a legal agreement between two sovereign states. And Mexico is essentially bankrupt. But rather than reforming the finances, what Maximilian does is he sets up a commission, throughout history, what any government does if it doesn't want to take immediate action, that will report back to him and he'll make reforms. And in the meantime, he's going to go on a tour of his kingdom. Now, this is something that he's often criticized for. His opponents call him a royal tourist. He loves to go out in the countryside and see Mexico and see his subjects. Maximilian would argue that for a monarch who's completely unknown in Mexico, that's exactly what you need to be doing. So I'll leave it to listeners to decide whether it's practical politics or not. On the flip side, what he does do very effectively is he's able to win over Juaristas, supporters of Benito Juarez, because, as we said, he's a liberal. Now, again, listeners who've been paying close attention will remember that the whole reason why a monarchy was required in the first place and called for by Mexican conservatives was because Benito Juarez had attacked the Catholic Church, crucially nationalizing church property. Now, instead of overturning those reforms, those liberal reforms, which is what his allies expect, he confirms them. Now, this does alienate his conservative supporters, but it does win over Juaristas to his government. And in fact, people who have served under Benito Juarez's government, who fought against conservatives in that civil war, come over into Maximilian's cabinet, become his supporters. So he's effective at winning over some supporters of Benito Juarez because of his charisma and his liberal policies. So it's a mixed record, I would say. He has a vision for the empire which is liberal. It does win over some high-profile converts, but perhaps the longer-term, deeper problems of the Mexican government are not addressed as quickly as they should be.
One of the things that puzzled me in this story is how the conservatives continually undermine Maximilian. He may be more liberal than they'd like, but compared to Juarez, I mean, when you look at how the church behaves, it seems like they're cutting their own throats.
Yeah. You're absolutely right, Russell, and it's extraordinary. I suppose what the Conservatives would say, and this is the very clerical reactionary wing of the Conservative Party, Catholics who believe in the supremacy of the Pope, would argue is that they're being true to the Catholic religion. But from a political point of view, it's disastrous because they undermine the empire. So they withdraw active support. In some cases, they openly clash with the government and work against it. There's a great quote by the Archbishop of Mexico, a man called Labastida, who's one of the great reactionaries and refuses to compromise. And he says that the only thing that Mexico has in common with the current century, i.e. the 19th century, is the date. Nothing more. So this is when Maximilian and his French commanders tell them we need to have church-state relations similar to what we have in France. It's the kind of this is the spirit of the century in progress. He says, that just doesn't apply in Mexico, and works to undermine Maximilian's government. Yeah, absolutely.
I think there was one occasion, and it may be before Maximilian got there, when it was just the French, where the French ended up pulling up some cannons and pointing them at the church doors if the Archbishop wouldn't open them. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is because Labastida believes that the whole point of the intervention and indeed the creation of the monarchy is reactionary at heart, and is going to overturn these reforms. And this is where the complexity of Napoleon III comes in, because Napoleon III specifically writes to every single military commander, and he says, I will not allow my flag to become the flag of reaction in Mexico. Because Napoleon III sees himself as a liberal, but also, if you go back to the French Revolution, the first one, 1789, one of the cornerstones of the settlement of the revolution is the nationalization of church property, which then goes into the hands of the peasants. So what is it by the mid-19th century? That's a very uncontroversial policy. In fact, to overturn that in France would be would be madness. I mean, it's hard to think of a sort of parallel. I don't know, returning when Margaret Thatcher sold off social housing, returning that to councils or whatever, something like that. It's a sort of cornerstone of a certain kind of strand of politics. In Mexico, of course, it's only just happened. So there's these completely different and disjuncture really between the two visions for the countries.
But things are going pretty well. I mean, even with the Conservatives being difficult, the French armies are there. They've got some pretty competent generals. Bazaine, I think the French general, is very competent. They've got Mejia, the indigenous general, and he's excellent. Juarez is being pushed back and back and back. Maximilian is perhaps in a slightly dilettante way. He's bringing the liberals on side, though. So what goes wrong?
So you're right. They have. So Achille Bazaine is the French commander-in-chief. So he's the fourth one, but he will be the last one. And you're right. He is very competent, although it's quite a low bar given what's gone before. And some listeners might be surprised to hear that he's competent in Mexico, because he's better known for his role in the Franco-Prussian War, where he is. I don't think, even with the best one in the world, many people would say that he conducted himself well in that conflict. But I think that's a case of being promoted above his pay grade. He was a very brave, very heroic soldier who worked his way up from a private soldier to become a Marshal of France. He led from the front, and at this point he's a man of action who's cut his teeth in the Foreign Legion, in Carlist Wars, in North Africa, etc. And he's very good, organizing 30,000 men in Mexico. And remember that Benito Juarez's armies have been defeated at Puebla, so it's really now just guerrilla forces, except for a few regular units, which are pretty quickly picked off by the French army, because of course the French army is well supplied and equipped and disciplined, and is able to win when it's in open warfare. Add to that the Imperialistas. You mentioned Tomás Mejía. Mejía is an absolutely phenomenal military commander, a cavalry officer, again, from one of the indigenous peoples of Mexico. Actually, he cut his teeth fighting against the Apaches in North Mexico, then against the US, then in the Civil War, and he's a very effective commander. So they pushed the Juaristas right back to the extremities of Mexico. But there is a problem, which is that Benito Juarez remains undefeated, and so there is a rival power. And while you do have effective military command under the French and indeed Imperialista generals, you also have people like Charles Dupin. Now, Charles Dupin is sort of the opposite of Bazaine. Bazaine is a ruthless soldier and is very happy for the sort of counterinsurgent tactics of colonial warfare to be deployed in Mexico. But they're carried out by people like Charles Dupin. Now, Charles Dupin is basically a soldier of fortune. He was actually kicked out of the French army for looting the palace in Peking during the Second Opium War, and then selling all of that loot in Paris. And that was too much even for the Second Empire and the French, and he was fired. But as soon as the intervention in Mexico is launched, he gets involved because he said, I excel in these conditions. And what that means is he's put in charge of something called the counter-guerrillas, right? This is a force set up to deal with the Juarista insurgency, which by now has become guerrilla warfare. And Charles Dupin's métier is torture, executions, and burning down of whole villages at the slightest provocation. So this is a problem that you're going to see in much later Western military interventions, is how do you win over hearts and minds, no matter how noble your moderate liberal ideas are at nation building and regenerating Mexico, when you are burning down villages, killing innocent people, and even people who may not be innocent in your eyes, i.e. maybe they are Juaristas, are being brutally tortured, murdered, and done away with. And actually, Charles Dupin, he writes this extraordinary letter to his niece, where he says, I have waged an atrocious war. If I were Mexican, how much hatred I would have for the French and how I'd make them suffer. And you just think, well, if that's what he's writing to his niece, I mean, what's actually going on the ground, right? I mean, how bad is it? And that's the version that he's presumably, dressed up to be slightly more palatable for his family. So you've got this contradiction between Maximilian's lofty ambitions and the reality on the ground, which is murder and rape and destruction from parts of the French army. So you've got Benito Juarez. So you've got an opposition that people can rally to, and this resistance is heroic. I mean, he's wandering to sort of northern deserts of Mexico with sort of 200-300 people by the summer of 1865, and he's on the point of defeat. What goes wrong? What changes? Well, there's first, the financial problems are never solved, but we'll come on to that because the second thing that changes is more important at this stage. The US Civil War comes to an end in April 1865. Now, Napoleon III shows himself to be a terrible foreign policy analyst because in March of 1865, he writes to Maximilian and says, don't worry, the US Civil War is going to go on for much longer. And within a month, Robert E. Lee is surrendered. This means that the United States of America, which had been terrified of meaningfully opposing the French intervention in Mexico because it might bring France into the Civil War, it might mean a recognition of the Confederacy, it could mean all kinds of terrible things for the Union. That's no longer a concern. There had been an arms embargo, i.e. you couldn't sell any arms to any country, but really that just means Mexico because that's where the conflict is. That's lifted in May 1865. Juaristas are able to get credit from US supporters, and there's a lot of sympathy in the US because they see this very much in terms of defending republics and democracies and so on and so forth. So Benito Juarez is able to resupply, he's able to rearm, and crucially, French troops are withdrawn from the border of Mexico, of the US-Mexican border, because Napoleon III is terrified that what was meant to be a very simple plan that would have been done in the year 1862 is going to spark a conflict, a border clash with US troops, and suddenly you've gone from a simple conflict that was meant to be over in 1862, raiding out the glory of France in Latin America, to war with the United States. So the French army is pulled back from the border, literally at the point that it's going to capture Benito Juarez, who's holed up in a place called El Paso del Norte, which listeners will know, which is on the US border. Listeners will know much better today as Ciudad Juarez, named after Benito Juarez, and it's a border town at the time, and now of course a city.
But eventually the French leave completely, don't they? Is this pressure from America, or is this that they've run out of what? It's
both. It's the difficulty of defeating Benito Juarez is the first point, right? And that's that difficulty they've had since 1862. Combined with the fact that Maximilian is proving to be, in the eyes of Napoleon III, a woefully ineffectual ruler of Mexico. He's doing all kinds of things like expanding free education and opening academies of arts and sciences. And he writes all of these letters saying, look how much I've achieved. To which the foreign ministry and Napoleon III responded, yes, no one appreciates more than us the benefits of universal education. However, the military, political, and economic organization of the country is in complete disarray. When are you going to do something about it? Now, Maximilian fails to resolve the finances. It's debatable whether anyone ever could have done. And at the end of 1865, he's unable to maintain those monthly payments to keep the French army in Mexico. So he writes a letter to Napoleon III and says, well, look, I can't make this month's payments, but obviously we're friends. We all want this to work. Can you just cover the cost? Napoleon III says absolutely not. He uses this as the occasion to do what he's been wanting to do for some time, which is announce that French troops are coming home. He's under pressure domestically because it's never been popular in France. No one really understands why 30,000 French troops are in Mexico and what's the possible benefit to France of that. You've got Prussia rising and problems in Europe kind of bubbling away, and having 30,000 troops in Mexico doesn't seem to be a particularly useful deployment of the French army. But it's the US opposition that's crucial. In that same month that Maximilian writes to say, I can't make the payments, William Sherwood, the US Secretary of State, writes, essentially gives Napoleon III an ultimatum: get your troops out of Mexico, or it will be war with the United States.
So the French troops are leaving. They don't leave right away, do they? Napoleon gives them a bit of time, but they're on their way out. So this seems to be the ideal moment for Maximilian to say, I came here because of Napoleon III. He stabbed me in the back. I'm washing my hands of it. So why doesn't he?
Well, that's absolutely, in fact, what he does do, because Napoleon III in January 1866 announces to the French people that the troops are coming home. It's a mission accomplished moment. He says the reason they're coming home is because we've won, and that the government is consolidated. Maximilian's regime is consolidated. Benito Juarez has been defeated, and therefore French troops are coming home. Mission accomplished moment. And as you say, phase withdrawal, they're not going to come back until the end of 1867, so that gives Maximilian, nearly 2 years of French support. When Maximilian hears that Napoleon III has broken his word, and remember, he was desperate to get Maximilian to go, because it's incredibly embarrassing to organise and orchestrate regime change with 30,000 French troops and hundreds of millions of francs, only for the monarch not to turn up and govern that regime. So he writes Maximilian several letters saying that, whatever happens, my support will not fail you. His support has massively failed because he's bringing troops down. Maximilian, when he learns of this, he's sort of rather petulant. He says, well, fine. If you don't want me here, I'll abdicate. I'm coming, that's it. It's done. It's over. I'm going home. Which would have been a sensible option. But when his wife, Carlotta, discovers this decision, she goes apoplectic. She is furious. Now, remember, again, people have to have very good memories. She is the daughter of the Belgian king, but her mother is the daughter of a French king, Louis Philippe. Louis Philippe was the king in 1848 of France who abdicated. And this was told to Carlotta as a humiliation and shame upon the family, which would never be erased. So when she would have been 8 years old, but her grandmother would always, would tell her that this had ruined the family, that they were laughing stock, and that that Louis Philippe didn't need to abdicate. He just needed to show a little bit of backbone. So Carlotta writes a 10-page memorandum to her husband explaining that he is a coward and an idiot, and that he has humiliated the name of Habsburg, so on and so forth, and that he must not abdicate it. And I don't know if any listeners will have ever received a 10-page memorandum from their partner, but you've got to seriously consider your life choices if you do, which is what Maximilian does. Now, Carlotta has a plan. She will go back to Europe. She will speak to Napoleon III. She will lay the letters in front of him where he has said that his support will never fail, and she will shame him into changing his mind.
And how well does that go?
Well, as you might expect, Napoleon III, and I have quite a lot of sympathy with him here, is very keen to avoid this meeting with Carlotta. So she sails back to Europe. She arrives in August of 1866. And we can say, can I come to the palace? Can I see Napoleon III? He's like, well, no, I'm not feeling very well. Why don't you go to Belgium and see your brother first? And, all of this stuff. But eventually, Carlotta, as I say, she's made of sterner stuff than that. She says, I will literally break into the palace. Wherever you are, I will find you, sort of Liam Neeson style. And she manages to get the meeting with Napoleon III, and she's done her homework. She's brought the letters, she's brought a memorandum explaining how the empire can work, how the finances can be reformed, etc. When she lays the letters that Napoleon III has written, saying, my support will never fail you, in front of the Emperor of the French, he reads them, and he breaks down, and he starts crying. But he doesn't change his mind. The decision has been made, and Carlotta makes many arguments, but all of them fall on deaf ears. There's no way that Napoleon III will change his mind. He is not going to go to war with the United States of America to prop up his protege in Mexico. And so, eventually, to cut a long story short, she's sort of fobbed off with this idea that she'll talk to his ministers, and if she can persuade the ministers, then they'll persuade Napoleon III. But a decision's been made, and it comes to nothing. Now, she's got one more trick up her sleeve. Because, remember, Maximilian's liberal reforms had alienated his Catholic constituency in Mexico.
Right.
If the Pope can essentially, to use a terrible anachronism, sign off, if a concordat can be agreed with the Pope, then any good Catholic has to get behind them, because although you might disagree with them, the Pope has agreed to them, and of course that trumps your own personal views on the situation. So Carlotta will go to the Vatican, she will speak to the Pope, and win over him to Maximilian's liberal reforms, and thereby get Catholic Mexico on board. Now, she has convinced her husband to stay in Mexico on the proviso that she will be able to persuade Napoleon III to support him, and she's failed in that. And so Maximilian's life, and indeed his decision to stay, etc., is essentially riding on this mission to the Vatican. And it's an enormous amount of pressure, and it's under that pressure that Carlotta begins to become somewhat delusional. She thinks that Napoleon III is the principle of evil upon earth. That's what she calls him. And is showing a sort of alarming signs of paranoia. She thinks that, she's being watched by Napoleon III's spies and so on and so forth. But she's still operating fairly normally, and she goes to meet the Pope. The talks are inconclusive. There's another meeting, and again, not much is decided, and the Pope's slightly worried about her mental state, as many of her entourage are, but empresses, they can do what they want. There's going to be a follow-up meeting, but she can't wait for it. So she, very early one morning, she insists that her servants drive her to the Vatican. She breaks into the Vatican, just sort of walks past the man on the door. How do you stop the Empress of Mexico? Demands to see the Pope. Of course, there's no appointment. This is highly irregular, but the Pope is eventually sort of roused in his papal pajamas to come out into the and see Carlotta. Instead of discussing church-state relations, she collapses in uncontrollable sobs on the floor, screaming that Napoleon III is out to kill her, and that her entire entourage, her servants, the politicians that have come from Mexico, people she's known and worked with for years now, are in his pay and are hired assassins. So this is in the long and short of it is her mind is unraveled. She's lost all reason, and she wouldn't have been able to convince the Pope anyway. This is Pope Pius IX, I think it's the ninth. I'll get my Piuses wrong. Who had just declared that the liberalism was anathema to God, essentially, and evil. So all of Maximilian's reforms would never have been accepted anyway. But perhaps more importantly, Carlotta has completely lost all reason, and in fact is eventually bundled out of the Vatican and sequestered in Miramar, and then later her Belgian family take her to Belgium, and she never returns to Mexico.
Do we know what her illness was? People say, her mind collapsed or it unraveled, but is there any medical diagnosis of this?
Yeah, well, it's always tricky diagnosing from the past. And I did speak to a psychologist about this, and they did explain what it might be, but I've forgotten what the term is, which is not very good. Which is poor.
Or just say she went mad.
Yeah, she did. So it's when we have any listeners out there who are sort of amateur or professional psychologists, it's delusion and paranoia, which comes across in her writings. As I say, she calls Napoleon III the principle of evil upon earth, Paris is Babylon, and that Napoleon III is trying to kill her, right? She genuinely believes that she's trying to be poisoned. She refuses to eat any food that's not been prepared and killed in front of her, right? So there's one servant she trusts. In the apartments in Rome where she's staying, there's live chickens tied to tables, and which have to be slaughtered and cooked in front of her. And she will only eat nuts and oranges, so things that, she can peel herself that haven't been poisoned. But then she also has moments of lucidity where she seems to be perfectly normal and understands what's going on, and other times where she isn't. So if anyone thinks that that's enough to go on, then they can perhaps get in touch. But she never recovers fully. And of course, in the 19th century practice was to sequester and isolate people who exhibited these symptoms, which I think, nowadays we would say is only going to exacerbate and make worse. So she'd say she never fully recovers.
Yeah, it's one of the saddest parts of the story, this formidable person sort of collapsing completely. But anyway, well, now, at this stage, I think you can get a cable to Mexico.
You can.
And so presumably Maximilian knows pretty quickly that the mission has failed.
Fairly quickly, yeah.
And at this stage, you would think, right, that's it. Now's the time to leave.
Yeah.
but it doesn't quite work out like that.
The cable's interesting. The transatlantic cable, it's laid in 1865, but then doesn't, and there had been one earlier, in fact, but it's 1865 one that works, although then it stops working, comes back in 1866, sort of in basically like bad Wi-Fi. And Maximilian, as he says, he's a scientist. He sends this rather touching telegram to Napoleon III on the 15th of August, 1866. So this is the Napoleon Day, which is a sort of national holiday under Bonaparte's regimes. And he says, greetings and happy birthday to your uncle on using the most wondrous scientific device of our age. Doesn't get a reply back from Napoleon III, and it's sort of in this tiny small communication, it shows a lot of Maximilian's kind of naivety, his love of science, and also his delusion in a sort of about a sentence. So that's really interesting. But it's not from Mexico to Europe. It's via New York. And so actually it does take quite a long time for those messages to come back and forth. It's very unreliable. But he gets the message towards the end of October. So this whole episode happened sort of beginning, and a few weeks later he finds out. His universe shatters, and he does, Russell, exactly what you said he should do. He decides to abdicate for the second time. I mean, remember, he'd only stayed there because of Carlotta. So he's very quickly decides to abdicate. He leaves Mexico City. His furniture is packed up. His archive is packed up. And in fact, all of that is shipped to Europe. But he doesn't leave immediately. He goes to a town near Veracruz so that he can more quickly get information from Europe. And also, of course, he's decided to leave, so he's ready to leave. You can't stay in Veracruz because it's yellow fever is prevalent there, and so it's sort of death house for any European travellers. So he's in the sort of hills outside, but not far away. He decides to abdicate, but he is eventually talked round by a number of people, not least his conservative allies, who know that if he leaves, as you said earlier, they have now realised that. It might be okay to oppose the empire while the empire survives, because you can change the policy of the empire. If the empire goes, and of course if the emperor leaves and the empire is finished, then Benito Juarez's liberal regime will take over, and there will be an even worse situation than they would have been under Maximilian. And so they are determined to fight a civil war come what may. They give him all kinds of promises. They promise tens of millions of dollars, tens of thousands of men. They argue that once the French army has gone, counterintuitively, their fortunes will revive because despite not having the French army, they won't have the taint of foreign intervention. And so Maximilian again does what anyone who's indecisive and prevaricates will do. He summons his ministers and advisors, council of state, to the town he's staying in to hold a meeting, and they will vote on the future of the empire. I suppose, for British listeners, this is the no confidence vote. And rather than listen to the deliberations of his ministers and advisors, he actually goes butterfly hunting, which is something he's wanted to do at kind of key moments, which doesn't reflect well on him. But, maybe he wanted them to speak independently, who knows. And he, the result of that vote is that he should stay as emperor of Mexico, and he is taught around.
But the French, Bazaine, basically says they're going to kill you, right? Bazaine has no illusions.
Bazaine has no illusions. Napoleon III sends one of his top aides to Mexico as well to convince Maximilian to abdicate. The French are convinced that once they leave, the empire will swiftly collapse. And Bazaine says something which is inherent, which is absolutely true, is once the French go, you will no longer be emperor of Mexico. You will merely be the head of a faction fighting a civil war that you will likely lose, which is rather prophetic. But so Maximilian has a deep hatred for the French because Napoleon III has abandoned him in his eyes. And in fact, he's not wrong in that. There's also the Mexican conservatives are very critical of French policy, and he had a very difficult relationship with Bazaine because, of course, he's emperor of Mexico, but unlike most emperors, he's not commander-in-chief of his own armed forces, and military policy always is from Paris. And in fact, actually, a lot of other policy is quite dictated from Paris. By this point, his hatred of the French probably blinding him to the good advice that he's getting from the likes of Bazaine. And in fact, he actually refuses, this is a sort of sign of the kind of petulance. He now refuses to speak in French as well. So, when his French officers come to him, he'll answer them in Spanish, which is, so goes this sort of, within all of the kind of chaos and grandeur of the drama, there's sort of moments of pettiness that are quite enjoyable, I think.
Does he have any chance in the war that follows? Because he then marches back to the capital. Yeah. He has Mejia. So So they organise their forces and they push out north to confront the liberal armies. So what's next?
Right. So, well, does he have a chance? Is a great question. The chance they think that he has rests on his generals. So we mentioned Tomás Mejía. You've also got Leonardo Marquez and another guy, Miguel Miramon. And these are the three, alongside Maximilian. They all begin with M, which, because the imperialistas sort of think, oh, it's some kind of sign. And actually they've got another one called Mendez. So they've got 5 M's. I suppose it's, if you know your 90s football, it's a sort of Sheringham and Shearer, the SAS. That's the sort of hope that they're applying. They are good generals. But Benito Juárez has got plenty of good generals. In fact, one called Mariano Escobedo, who's going to become important in our story. He might have had a chance if the Conservatives have delivered on the promises that could partially convince him to stay, right? If they could get hold of tens of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of men. They don't. So the plan is a desperate one. They are going to march out to what had been an imperialista stronghold, a town called Querétaro. And Querétaro is about 130 miles northwest of Mexico City. It's where Tomás Mejía, it's the region where he's from. And as I say, conservative stronghold, lots of convents and churches. And, it's a sort of centre of Catholic conservatism, popular conservatism. Maximilian will march out a relief force because the forces under Mejía and Miramon are beleaguered and about to be, attacked by Carlistas. But it's on the 13th of February that Maximilian is going to lead out this relief force with Leonardo Marquez, who's another one of the M's. And he only has 1,500 men, so 1,500, and they're only able to scrape together 50,000 pesos. And pesos is exactly the same as a dollar, so it's $50,000. That he has, which is nothing. And the other thing is that he has to march this force out. So sort of his authority has dwindled so much that he doesn't control the countryside between what essentially is London and Birmingham, but much more rough terrain than that. And it's hilly country and it's controlled by Juarista guerrillas. So he's constantly fighting to get this military convoy through. It resembles much more an armed crowd than an army as we might think it, because many of these men have just been taken off the streets of Mexico City and sort of press ganged into this army. They don't have uniforms. It's the poorest of the poor. There's the beggars, the homeless, just rounded up and, well, now you're in the Imperialista army. And that is something that Maximilian had been one of his flagship policies, was to end forced conscription. So he's in real, it's real desperation, desperate measures. So, and the plan is not a good one. The plan is that he would lead the small relief force, meet up with the larger Imperialista army, which, by the way, is about 9,000 men. And with him as commander-in-chief, no longer encumbered by French troops and authority, he would lead the army to a glorious victory over the Juaristas, and that will restore confidence throughout Mexico in the empire. So it's a last gasp hurrah. The problem with having so many good generals is that they all have very conflicting plans. So although Maximilian is commander-in-chief, he brings his usual indecision to the role, which is to have a council of war, discuss, for days on end what they should do. And there's difference of opinion. Miramon argues that there are 3 Juarista armies converging on Querétaro, on the town which they're in. They'll be under siege by about 30 to 40,000 troops, so outnumbered at least 3 to 1. Miramon says we march out and we defeat each army individually because they're coming from approaching from different sides of the town. But it's Miramon's advice is ignored. Marquez is in favour of this man called Leonardo Marquez, who argues we should wait for reinforcements. Those reinforcements never come. The city has been under siege, and it's a disastrous place to be under siege because it's 3 sides surrounded by heights. The Imperialistas don't have the men to occupy the high ground, the hills, so the Juarista artillery sets up on these hills, and everywhere within the town is now in range of Juarista artillery, and a siege begins in the beginning of March.
What do they do now? Do they try to escape?
They don't. So what initially, the town is fairly well supplied, and they do have troops in Mexico City, and in fact, Leonardo Marquez, who we just mentioned, he's the sort of nominal second to Maximilian. And he had insisted that Maximilian had thousands of foreign volunteers from Belgium and Austria. Most of those have gone home, but some, the sort of diehards, are still in Mexico City, and they form a very effective fighting force. So Marquez argues, well, what we'll do is those are the reinforcements, they will come and they'll break the siege. And Marquez is actually able to break out of the siege with about 1,000 men. And so they're not too worried initially, Maximilian and the rest of the imperialist army, because they managed to break out fairly easily. So you can do it with 1,000 men. You can probably do it with 9,000 men if you have to. But more importantly, they're waiting for reinforcements. And this is a sort of, these are Austrian and Belgian soldiers who've been fighting for 3 years. This is not the people scraped off the streets. They're relatively well armed, equipped and trained. So they're hopeful that force will come and break the siege. But weeks go, it's meant to be 2 weeks. 2 weeks comes, no sign of Marquez. 3 weeks, no sign of Marquez. 4 weeks, etc. And in fact, Marquez isn't coming back. He's disobeyed orders. He's gone to Puebla to try and break another siege. We're seeing himself as sort of the savior of the empire, and he's defeated disastrously. And the force that's meant to relieve Maximilian is defeated, and then itself becomes besieged in Mexico City. So then they try and break out. They very nearly do manage it on one occasion, but they're too slow to get their act together and actually march out towards Mexico City. And then, if they had done, it's very unlikely they would have been able to achieve anything. And so, yeah, it ends, well, very dramatically, but it ends with Maximilian surrendering.
Yes, he's betrayed, isn't he, by somebody who lets the liberal forces into the town, and he's sort of grabbed, if I remember it right.
That's absolutely right. So he's betrayed by one of his most loyal officers, a man called Miguel Lopez, and who goes across into the Juarista lines and essentially leads the Juarista forces into the imperialist citadel, the stronghold, a convent where the headquarters are, standing down imperialista guards. Maximilian is allowed to, is not captured at that moment and makes a final stand on a nearby hill overlooking the town called the Hill of the Bells, which is going to be significant. But he sees below him the town is overrun. He asks Mejia if they can break out, and Mejia says, "I don't care for my own life, but I'm not going to lead a suicidal charge that would kill you." And Maximilian is eventually surrenders to Mariano Escobedo, as we say, and that's a quite extraordinary moment as Maximilian Habsburg, born in the Imperial Palace of Vienna, surrenders his sword to Mariano Escobedo, a sort of a farmhand from northern states of Mexico, Nuevo Leon. And you've got this sort of hugely symbolic moment as European royalty surrenders to a former Mexican farm labourer.
So Maximilian, he's now a prisoner. So what are they going to do with him? Right,
well, Maximilian, fairly hopeful that he'll be let off, because you don't normally execute heads of state. The two kind of opposite examples would be Napoleon I, who, despite having the entire continent of Europe ranged against him, was put into exile not once but twice, right? You think the first time, okay, but once you come back, then they... But no, he's executed twice. He's exiled twice, not executed. And in the US, you've just had a civil war where Jefferson Davis, as president of the Confederacy, has committed the most egregious act of treason possible against the Union. He's imprisoned and then eventually pardoned and amnestied. So Maximilian is initially fairly confident. But Benito Juarez is made of sterner stuff than either, those in charge of the Union or indeed all of the monarchies of Europe, because he wants to end a civil conflict that has been raging in Mexico since at least 1857. So you've got 10 years of conflict between liberals and conservatives. And so he's keen to have Maximilian court-martialed, and it's a show trial. It's held in an actual theatre, and the theatre, and this will be, as I say, we keep giving tests to the listeners, so this will be a really good test. The theatre is named after Iturbide, who was the first emperor of Mexico, who was shot. So it's not very subtle. It's political theatre. It's not very subtle. Maximilian actually manages to get out of the trial. He claims he's too sick and ill. And he is. He's very sick and ill. He's been suffering from fevers. He's got dysentery. His doctor thinks he might have malaria. He's taking opium pills for the pain. So he's not been well or indeed, very particularly compos mentis for some time now. He's excused from the trial, but the trial lasts a day and a half. I mean, it's nothing. And the deliberation and it's a court-martial, not a civil trial. And they're junior officers in the Mexican Republican Army. And it's no surprise that they come to the verdict of execution.
They've decided to execute Maximilian. And as I recollect it, the Americans are sending messages saying, don't carry it out. The Europeans are sending messages. So what do they do and why?
Yeah, so the United States of America is very keen for Juarez not to execute Maximilian and makes very diplomatic pressure on him. Of course, the European courts say the same thing. Prominent Republicans like Garibaldi from Italy, Victor Hugo from France, write to Juarez and say, you'll stain the cause of republicanism if you execute Maximilian. But again, as I said, Benito Juarez doesn't care. He is thinking about what's Mexico and Mexican politics. And he argues that it's necessary for the future of the Republic. And we focus on Maximilian. Of course, my book focuses on Maximilian. He's executed alongside Tomás Mejía, who we've mentioned a few times, and Miguel Miramón. Now, Miramón was the leader and indeed president of the Conservative Party in the Civil War before Maximilian. And Mejía had fought alongside Miramón and, of course, alongside Maximilian. And you've got three men who represent different strands of conservatism in Mexico. Miguel Miramón is what we call the Creole elite, i.e. he's descended from Spaniards and is sort of gentry aristocracy of Mexico. Tomás Mejía, indigenous, representing popular, pious conservatism and rural movements that support the Conservative Party. And Maximilian, who, of course, represents European monarchy and foreign intervention. And this is a sort of unholy alliance for Benito Juarez that has constantly been preventing Mexico becoming the modern secular liberal state he thinks it needs to be. And quite frankly, he has had enough. And this is his way of saying that form of conservatism and that challenge to the liberal Republic of Mexico will never, ever rise again. And in that, it's fairly successful because, even to this day, the word conservative is, and you see this with the current president of Mexico, is an insult not a million miles away from how we might describe someone as a fascist. As a meaningful political project, conservatism in Mexico is ended by this conflict and by these executions. So, as I say, Benito Juarez, as much as Maximilian and Carlotta and Napoleon III is convinced of his destiny, and Benito Juarez's destiny is to end a decade of civil conflict and for liberalism to triumph.
I feel, just because you get invested in the story, I feel terribly sorry for Maximilian, but I do find it hard to forgive him for continuing a war once it's lost, and all these people that he brings, the ordinary soldiers, his generals, all these people who are brought to their deaths by his naivety, by his foolishness, and by, I guess, his vanity.
You're absolutely right, and I think the first time he doesn't abdicate, you could perhaps forgive. Carlotta's terrifying, but also there's a plan. And if that plan works, maybe there's a future. The second time is, it's understandable, but it's difficult to forgive. And it's tied to these 90, as you say, he essentially brings thousands of people down with him and needlessly prolongs the conflict. I suppose if you to look for sort of, explanations, he's isolated, he's deluded, he's sick. But also it's this idea of honor. It's a 19th century idea of honor, which I think is quite hard. Well, I know is quite hard for a contemporary audience to think about. So I'm a terrible coward, and I would never have gone. But if I had gone, I would have abdicated, probably when I got there. And no honor would not even be wouldn't even enter my head that there was such a thing. For a Habsburg who's grown up with these ideas of the name of Habsburg and honor is central, a phrase that is often used against him and he himself uses as a true Habsburg never leaves their post. This is something that he said in one of his Independence Day speeches. But it's something I think, and also just to illustrate it, when Carlotta, the death of Maximilian is kept from Carlotta for about 6 months because her family are too worried about her mental state. When she is told, she's distraught, throws herself into the arms of her sister-in-law. But she says that, the pain of Maximilian's death is offset by the honor in which he faced it. Now, I think if you look at the Manet painting, which is the famous depiction of Maximilian's death, it does seem honorable. But if you look at what the actual depiction of it was, and there's a quite good sort of early, what we call Photoshop, it's a composite photo recreating what it looks like. it looks much more like if listeners might think of a sort of Western, right, where sort of three men are just put up against a wall and shot. It's squalid. It's not honourable, I would say. But it is a different conception, and Maximilian would have seen it as honourable. He's fond of quoting the line, "All is lost save honour," which I'm going to get which was by a French king defeated by Habsburg in the 16th century. I forget his name, possibly Francis. I'm going to get it wrong. Anyway, that's actually a misquote. Because the original letter that is sent by the French king is all is lost save my life and honour. I.e., so the man he's quoting didn't die. He's lost. Yeah, it was. He surrendered, but he didn't die. Whereas Maximilian thinks it's going to be heroic to die. He's weak, I think, ultimately, in that
yes.
he's too easily persuaded by Mexican conservatives, and he's too worried about his honor and what people will think of him back in Europe.
What's the fate of the man who sort of sent him out on this mission? What happens to Napoleon III?
It's extraordinary what happens to Napoleon III in the sense that it's on a larger scale and in a much shorter time frame. Napoleon III sort of goes through exactly what Maximilian did. So in 1870, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, and Napoleon III is, despite being extremely ill and not up to the job, becomes commander-in-chief. He marches out, although not like Maximilian, because he's actually driven out in extreme luxury, first by train and then by carriage with enormous sort of baggage trains. So he's not quite Max. I mean, what you have to say about Maximilian at the end is he's very brave and he's sharing the absolute hardship of his troops. Napoleon III isn't quite, because I say he's in luxury, but he goes to the town of Sedan on the French-German border, and is encircled by a much larger and powerful German army. He holds out for 2 days. Maximilian held out for 70 days plus. But what Napoleon III does do, which Maximilian doesn't, is Napoleon III realizes that the game is up and that they could fight on or they could try and break out, but he knows that tens of thousands of French soldiers will die. And so he does actually surrender, full well knowing that it will be the end of his regime. So you might say that actually by a 21st century conception, that's a more honorable thing to do. And so his regime, collapses and is sort of reviled he is reviled, and his regime is reviled in French history for quite some time, because he is seen as a traitor to the country responsible for this disastrous defeat. Bazaine, the French commander-in-chief, he actually becomes the commander-in-chief of the French army of the Rhine, essentially the only organized military force that's left after the Napoleon III's defeat at Sedan. And in again a sort of bizarre, reenactment, if you will, of what happens to Maximilian, he also surrenders his army, but this is seen as treason, and he is actually put on trial in 1873 and sentenced to death. Although that is eventually commuted to exile, imprisonment, and then he escapes from prison. So both Napoleon III and Bazaine very much got a taste of what Maximilian himself went through only 3 years later.
So Napoleon III, he ends up, I think, in England to live out a few more years of his life. Where does Bazaine end up? Does he also end up in England? It seems like we're the refuge of all these people.
No, so Napoleon III ends up in Chislehurst, in this rather beautiful golf club. Today a golf club, wasn't there, of course, called Camden Place. And it's just, and it's a wonderfully bucolic and lovely, sleepy kind of English still sort of really village, even though it's, a suburb of London, I suppose. It's an extraordinary place for a Bonaparte to live out his life, but he does. He dies in 1873. He is also, much worse than Maximilian. He's very ill. He's got bladder stones, which are incredibly painful, and it's actually a botched operation that ends up killing him, which must have just been agony. So if you come away, with the idea that Napoleon deserves some kind of comeuppance, I think you probably argue that with the Franco-Prussian War and this kind of agony that he dies in, it's probably gets that. Bazaine, his first wife was Spanish, and then his second wife is Mexican.
Yes, his second wife is, 16 when he marries her?
17, and he's 54 off the top of my head, but certainly in his mid-50s. And even by the standards of the 19th century, that causes quite a lot of raised eyebrows, not least by Maximilian and Carlotta, who think it's quite ludicrous. His wife ends up, so she obviously, it was an advantageous match in the sense that Bazaine was the most powerful man in Mexico and one of the most powerful people in France. But he dies in abject poverty in a sort of very insalubrious conditions in Spain, and his wife actually leaves him, goes back to Mexico, and he doesn't die till I think it's 1888. And when he does, the French press is sort of delights in sort of headlines like "Hooray, death of a traitor!" and it's an extraordinary sort of journey that he goes on. And yes, I say dies in squalor and poverty in Spain.
What happens to Eugenie?
Well, Eugenie, she lives for a long time. I think off the top of my head, she dies only in 1920. So again, these sort of Carlotta and Eugenie, the sort of imperial throwbacks that live on into the 20th century, which I always think is quite remarkable. But it's the Prince Imperial, which is the son of Napoleon III and Eugenie, who sort of has the full turnaround of the Bonaparte kind of sort of family legacy, because he dies in the British Army, fighting in the Zulu Wars in South Africa in 1879. So it's, I'd say, kind of bizarre to think that what I suppose would be the great nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte and the next in line, the Napoleon IV, had it gone that way, is killed in British Army uniform.
Good for Eugenie. She was another of the very powerful women in the story.
She was, and she blamed herself for the Mexican intervention, because she was instrumental in bringing it about, and indeed alighting upon Maximilian as the candidate. That was very much her who was pushing that.
So she expressed regret afterwards, did she? She
did, and she bore full responsibility, although she was very careful in trying to rehabilitate and manage the reputation of her husband and the Bonapartist legacy. So one must take what she says with a pinch of salt. She was the sort of sole surviving comms director of Bonapartism. So she's careful. She's careful to massage the image. But it's true that she played an instrumental role because she was Spanish, which I probably should have mentioned. She was Spanish aristocrat, and she had this kind of nostalgic view of the Spanish Empire in Mexico, and also was a staunch Catholic. So she very much bought into the idea that the Catholic Church in Mexico was under attack from impious atheist liberals, and therefore was able to provide access for Mexican conservatives to the French court and push them in front of Napoleon III. So she does play a key role.
But apart from Eugenie, for everybody else involved in the plan, it all ends pretty miserably, doesn't it?
It does. Well, and Carlotta, she doesn't die until 1927, which I always think is extraordinary. And, obviously the book focuses on this extraordinary period in her life from the age of about 17 to 25. But most of her life she spends in seclusion and semi-delusion and incredibly sad and lonely existence, lingering on into 1927.
So on that slightly depressing note, we should bring the podcast to a close. Thank you so much, Edward. That was great.
No, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favour to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible, because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.